Well, good evening and welcome to the Libby Book Club for WA. I'm your host, David Allan-Petale, and our guest tonight is Sarah Bailey, and we're going to be discussing her book, Body of Lies. This is the title that's actually being read across Australia for Together We Read. Together We Read is the biggest book club online in Australia, I think. I'm not bragging there, which is simultaneously people all over Australia are reading the same book, and the title is Body of Lies by Sarah Bailey. Sarah, thank you for joining us here on the Libby Book Club for WA. How are you going?
I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Indeed. And before we start, I'd just like to also acknowledge that I'm broadcasting tonight from the traditional lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present. And also to remind everybody that this is an interactive chat. It's not just me having a bookie chat to Sarah. You're also involved in it too. So if you do have a question, drop them into the chat. This is all thanks to the Libby Book Club for WA, Overdrive Australia, the State Library of WA, and of course Libby, who I've just been told have something like 500,000 subscribers now. So this is a very big
Amazing.
audience to tap into. So Sarah, I think I'll start with an absolute Dorothy Dixer of a question. What is
Okay.
what is Body of Lies about? Apart from it is the very latest and potentially final story involving DS Gemma Woodstock.
Okay. So the sort of the pitch of the book, I guess, is that there is a terrible car accident, and someone is brought into the hospital, just kind of hanging on to life, dies in emergency, and then their body is taken to the hospital morgue. That body is stolen from the hospital morgue, and the book kicks off, I guess, with the question, why would anyone want to do that, and who was the mystery corpse? Were they good, were they bad, were they something in between? And Gemma, the protagonist, happens to be at the hospital and eagerly inserts herself into the investigation, and then it goes from there.
It's been an absolutely cracking read. It's really matched. I think the weather that we've been having over here in Perth, we've had
Okay.
in Western Australia particularly, we've had a lot of rain. It's been quite dark and cold, so I've been curled up at night, just in my reading room, absolutely inhaling this book because,
Perfect.
like you said, there's a lot of strands that emerge, but also a lot of themes. There's a lot of characters. It presents as a crime story initially, but at the same time there's also some social commentary in there. There's a lot going on here in Body of Lies, but it's always moving forward. It's always propulsive. Was this a
Yeah.
fun book to write, to marshal all these forces and all these strands together?
Yeah, I think it was pretty fun to write. It's always, I think sometimes with themes in books, particularly maybe crime books, I certainly don't, and I don't know if other people do, but it's not sort of an intentional decision to kind of pull out different social commentary issues and cover lots of different themes and topics. It's sort of something that I feel finds its way into the story as you're writing. So I'll sort of be thinking about that main premise, which, in this instance was, why would someone want to steal a dead body, and who was that person? And then I guess around all of the elements of that crime, you're sort of bringing in different people, different motivations, and different reasons and rationales. And through that, I think is where you tend to explore different themes and commentary on sort of social justice and what's happening in technology, all kinds of different themes. So yeah, it is fun. I mean, it's not always fun. Like, I do find some aspects of writing really difficult, but broadly, it's a pretty amazing project to sort of tackle. And definitely when you feel like something's working, it's really satisfying. So yeah, it was overall a very positive experience.
Detective Sergeant Woodstock is a character that you've been with for a while now, but
Yeah,
it's each book in the series is a standalone. You don't have to have read the previous ones,
that's
but
right.
she's a very distinctive character. What was it like
Mm.
to come back to her for this, for what you're saying is going to be her final outing?
Yes, well, just yeah. Firstly, on that, you're right. Like, I see them very much as being four books that are very closely linked, but I know that a lot of people read them out of order,
Yeah.
which I don't mind. Obviously, it's great, but it's a bit perplexing to me because I keep thinking that I could never write them out of order. For me, they're so much a linear kind of build, and Gemma's on such a character journey, I suppose. So I know a lot of people have read this fourth book first, and then they sort of say to me, "I'm going to go back and read the others," and I'm like, how does that work? Like, that must be so strange. But of course, I've read other books out of order, and it's fine. So yeah, as you said, each book's got a standalone crime, so that's a very self-contained sort of plot point. It's really the Gemma journey that is the thing that builds over the 4 books. And look, yeah, it's always really nice for me to settle back into writing from Gemma's perspective. I know her well. It's first person. It's really through her eyes that the reader and myself are experiencing the story. And I sort of have settled into a good rhythm with her. So I really enjoyed coming back and writing this book after writing a standalone novel, The Housemaid. It was kind of nice to settle back into the Gemma world again. And yeah, I'm going to miss her a little bit, but I also feel quite good about where this story has ended. And I think it's kind of feels like the right place to leave her at this point. So for now, it's what I'm saying is the 4th and final book. Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about Gemma, perhaps if people aren't familiar with her who are listening in, but also where she's at when we meet her in Body of Lies,
Mhm.
because her life has changed quite a bit, but also she's been through quite a lot previously.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, she definitely has been through quite a lot. I always sometimes think, is it too much? And then my editor says, no, it's more. And I'm like, okay. But yeah, Gemma's a detective. In the first book, The Dark Lake, she's quite young. She's about 28 years old. She's very good at her job. She's risen up the ranks quite quickly and has sort of had a bit of a breakthrough case, which propelled her career forward, much to the dislike of a lot of her older male, stale colleagues. So she's a little bit of a battler in the workforce. She's got a lot of grief and a lot of sort of tragedy in her past. She lost her mother quite young, her high school boyfriend quite young. So she's carrying around a lot of emotional baggage. And in the Dark Lake, she's quite lost. And she's in a bit of a crisis point of her life, kind of really trying to make some pretty big decisions about her future. And then she sort of moves through the Dark Lake into the second novel. It's sort of her growing up book. I think she leaves the town that she's grown up in and has sort of a bit of an adventure. And then the third book, there's a few other bits and pieces that happen in her personal life, which kind of force her to return home. And that's a whole nother kind of journey that she has to go through. And then in this fourth and final book, it's 10 years after the first one. So 10 fictional years have passed. She's obviously grown up quite a lot. Her personal circumstances are very different from the first book, but she's still Gemma. So she's still very impulsive. She's very insecure. She's very frustrating sometimes. She does like to kind of, I guess she's quite competitive with her colleagues. And because she's a bit insecure, she really pushes herself front and center in the work kind of environment. So yeah, I think it's always a bit of a challenge, a good challenge to manage a character over time through different books and different stories and make sure that they are growing, because I think everyone reacts better to someone who is kind of learning from their mistakes and growing as a person, but also not fundamentally changing from sort of a values and motivations and drivers perspective. So it's kind of bit of a fine line to tread. So hopefully you kind of got that, pretty right.
And can we go maybe to just right to the start of Body of Lies, when the body goes missing, Gemma's in hospital, and all of those aspects of her character you just described come absolutely to the fore, because
Mm-hmm.
she immediately starts inserting herself into this case, even though she's in the hospital. She's got her baby with her, her dad's there. So she's
Yeah.
like, duty calls, but at the same time, all of the things that I need to juggle are now suddenly here.
Yeah. She's she's on parental leave in the start of this book, and she is sort of at a bit of a crossroads from a career perspective. She's got some decisions to make about her future and what it's going to look like. She's kind of grappling with all of that. She's visiting her dad, who's unwell in hospital, and this event happens. The body goes missing. The hospital goes into sort of emergency mode, and she is feeling extremely strange about not being in charge of the investigation, because normally in her, former sort of work life, she would be running the show, she'd be telling everyone what's going on, she'd be organizing everything. So she grapples between like standing back and leaving them to it, and then sort of throwing herself into the investigation, and she can't help herself. She basically sort of cannot resist not investigating what's happening. I think not only because of her being quite competitive and not wanting to miss out, but also because she's just genuinely so curious, and she's got a real detective brain. And so the thought of going home and kind of just, wondering what's happened, but leaving it be, is just not in her makeup. So she does kind of get herself involved, and a lot of her colleagues aren't particularly pleased about that. And then once she's kind of in, she's in, and she keeps getting further and further in. So she's kind of, before you know it, she's on parental leave with her baby, but she is very much working the case.
I enjoy her perspective, because she's right for a start. Like,
yeah,
so like very good at her job. But I also keep thinking like
yeah.
she's rubbing up against Detective Everett, who's always trying to diminish her and push her aside. But he acts in a very similar way to her. But so if a man acts that way, that's assertiveness and leadership. If a woman acts that way, that's challenging and being difficult. So
Annoying. Yeah.
So seeing that dichotomy playing out in real time in the book was really interesting for me to read.
I think so. Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, I can sort of see both sides of their dynamic. So Everett he's part of the workforce. He's a detective in the town. They only worked really briefly together before she went on parental leave. They didn't particularly like each other. He's now, leading this investigation. She's on parental leave. He doesn't appreciate her involvement and her kind of special comments. And, in fairness, he's kind of trying to do his job and probably doesn't really need a second opinion and someone confusing sort of the situation. But hopefully as the audience, you're kind of rooting for Gemma, and she is right, as you say, she's smart, she knows what she's doing, she's got the right kind of natural curiosity that I think most people find appealing. It is interesting because they're quite similar, but as you say, I think the natural kind of interpretation of their very similar reactions is different, because he's sort of seen as being the professional, confident guy, and she's kind of like a bit like a fly that everyone's just kind of trying to swat away, sort of go away, you're on leave, just leave it alone. I could go into a whole big rant about this, but men just so rarely experience that, because they don't go on leave and sort of have to step down from their job. So she's on leave, she probably shouldn't involve herself, but also I think everyone can kind of relate to the idea of being sort of sidelined and how that would feel, and the temptation to kind of be like, no, I can do this. So I think you hopefully root for Gemma, but can sort of see his perspective as well.
To shift on that as well, I also really enjoyed the character of Jonesy, because he recognizes her smarts, her drive, what she can bring, but he's also almost like he's back delegating like a good leader should. He's like, we've got this resource, why don't we use it? So he's quite wise.
He's a funny, he's very fun to write, actually. I probably of almost all the characters that I've ever written, I think Gemma's boss Jonesy is one of my favorites, because he's kind of that really lovely mix of gruff and very kind of male and blokey, but heart of gold, but sometimes a bit embarrassing and sometimes a bit out of touch, but sort of in like a meaning well way. A good leader, but maybe not obviously a good leader sometimes. I think, he's sort of seen as being a bit bumbling and stupid, but actually he really reads people quite well. So yeah, he's a good sort of mix of, I think on face value, what you perhaps first think of him doesn't end up being what he actually is. And his, as you say, his ability to recognize in Gemma some amazing qualities and the support that he gives her is, I think everyone needs that in their life somewhere. And especially in that environment with all of those sort of male cops and detectives who really kind of find Gemma just annoying, just, by being there. He's always backed her and sort of really given her a shot. And so, she owes a lot to him. They've got like quite a special relationship, I think.
If anybody has a question for Sarah, please jump in the chat. Anything and everything.
Anything's fine.
No,
Any questions are fine.
Sarah, she goes back to Smithson, which is her hometown. Can you tell us about Smithson and its place in Gemma's life?
I can, yeah. I mean, it's a funny story actually, because when I first wrote The Dark Lake, and that is set in Gemma's hometown, Smithson, it's a fictional town. I made it up. It's got bits and pieces borrowed from various places across Australia, but it's definitely not based on any particular place. And I was really trying to create like a generic town. And so I sort of had like, I'll just call it Smithson because Smith's a really common name and it's like just a generic place. And I had it there as like a holding name and was kind of planning on coming up with a better name or a more Australian name or whatever. And then it kind of got through the edit and no one had said anything. And then I thought, maybe it just works. And so it just ended up sticking. And I mentioned it to my editor just before it went to print. And she said, I think it's fine. It's kind of grown on me. I like it. So it was born literally out of being the intended generic town, insert name here kind of situation, which is sort of funny. But Smithson is a regional town. It's not near water. There's lakes, obviously, being the Dark Lake, but it's not a beach town. It's an inland town. It's quite hot. It's quite dry in summer. It's big enough that it's got everything, but it's small enough that if you're a cop, you would know a lot of people that come across your plate at work. It's got that kind of like someone's neighbour's dog's best friend sister has done this and everyone kind of knows about it vibe. And Gemma feels weirdly very trapped in the open spaces of that town in the first book. She has never been anywhere. She's never been overseas. She's very naive and sort of not street smart, I guess, from that perspective, even though she is a detective. And she's really starting to feel at the age of 28, very, very trapped by that beautiful regional landscape. And then, she obviously returns home and her feelings toward her hometown are very complicated. She loves it because her family's there. She knows it like the back of her hand. It's started to change a little bit. New people coming in, new development coming in. It's good for the town. It needs money coming into it. It's making it a bit different. And she does not know if she really wants to end up there, seeing as it was somewhere that she sort of spent the first 30 years of her life desperately trying to escape. So she's got a real complicated relationship with it.
You're saying before everybody knows everybody. You've got a wonderful character. It's Candy, the journalist, who
her friend.
She knows everybody, but she also knows where the bodies are buried, where the secrets are.
That's right.
She's someone who I suppose has reacted perhaps differently to the restrictions of the town. She's really leaning into it.
She has. I'm just going to turn my charger on because I've just realized it's not turned on and I don't want the computer to drop dead. Yes, Candy is Gemma's journalist friend. They go on a bit of a journey as a friendship as well. In the first book, The Dark Lake, when we meet both of them, but we meet Candy her and Gemma are not friends. They are sort of more like enemies or professional enemies, as is often the case with journalists and cops. You know, it's not always a wonderful relationship, even though there's, I think, quite a lot of respect there generally. Gemma finds Candy very irritating and frustrating. Candy finds Gemma sort of the same, but through a sort of sequence of events, they become close, and they end up becoming very, very good friends. So by the time this fourth book's happening, they are each other's best friends, really, and very similar, you know, women in kind of male-dominated industries trying to make it work, really hard workers, very ambitious, very diligent. So they've kind of got a lot in common, and they've also, I mean, Candy's a bit wilder than Gemma, and I mean that kind of makes sense because Gemma's the cop, so she's got to sort of slightly play things by the book, you know, to some extent, whereas Candy's kind of willing to go a little bit crazy, do whatever it takes, break all the rules. I think she's a lot of fun to read, and she's quite funny. Like, she tends to bring a bit of levity to situations, which, you know, I think the book needs, especially, you know, most crime books need a little bit of light. She tends to bring that. And yeah, I think, again, a lot of what writing Gemma is about is actually writing the characters in her orbit and how she needs them and how she reacts to them and vice versa. So someone like Candy is important sort of from a storytelling perspective because she pushes Gemma in a lot of ways that's actually quite helpful from a moving the plot forward perspective. So yeah, they make a good duo in this book, and it's always fun pairing a cop and a journo together because even though they're sort of tackling the same case or the same story, they are coming at it from slightly different perspectives because they both sort of want the same outcome, but the journalist is always thinking about content. The cop is always thinking about, you know, closing a case, justice, and I guess making sure they're tying up all the loose ends. So it's it's the same thing, but just slightly different motivations, which, yeah, I think is interesting as well.
So when you're writing
Mm.
your books, particularly Body of Lies is like more than 400 pages. It's very character driven. You know,
Yeah.
it's definitely got the plot, it's definitely got all those things, but it's
Yeah.
the characters ruminating on things and exploring things. Is that a part of crime writing that's underestimated? That people often just think, oh, it's just, you know, it's a plot, it's some things that they've got to solve. It's not really character driven, but actually crime is almost totally character driven. And that
Yeah.
if you were just to focus on the crime, then, you know, it'd be like a 100-page book.
I think so. It's I think, I mean, I definitely think the answer to that question is yes. Like, it's crime for me is almost equal character and plot, really. I mean, I think any crime book that makes you feel sort of engaged has to have characters in it that you care about. The stakes have to be high, and the only way to really make the stakes high is to give yourself, you know, emotional connection to people and what their fate might be, or to be able to, you know, imagine yourself in that situation. What would I do? What if that was me? What if that was my kid, my mum, whatever? Like, I think that's sort of what crime is doing, and why everyone finds it so interesting, whether it's fictional, true crime, even the news, you know, all those things. So I think that, yeah, the idea that like a crime book is just plot is just, I think, generally speaking, not true. I mean, I'm trying to think about a crime book that I think is not character driven, and I can't really think of one. I think there's sometimes action thrillers that are quite propulsive, and they're sort of driven along by the momentum of events. And
So,
maybe, you know, the character might be a bit more wooden, or the backstory is pretty light, or it feels a bit shallow. And that's fine. Like, I think if you can maintain a whole novel, doesn't really matter how you do it. You know,
yeah.
if it's able to be done, that's great. I'm not sort of criticizing it, but I guess crime's kind of got action at certain points, but a lot of what drives the books forward is actually relationships and interactions, and whether it's connections or betrayals, or, you know, all of those types of things. And they are kind of part of the plot, I think, more than sort of in tandem with the plot. You know, I sort of think like something happens, but often the something that happens is actually more driven by characters as opposed to just action. So yeah, it's all intertwined, I think. And I certainly know that my favorite crime books are the ones that have characters that I care about and remember. And I think a good test sometimes is like if you haven't read a crime book for a couple of years and you think back to it, I often can't actually remember exactly what happened, but I
Yeah.
remember the character, you know, and sort of, do I like them? What are they all about? What are their relationships like? So I don't know. I think that kind of says a lot about what works in crime.
I love that. Yeah, it's like, yeah, it's not what you do, it's how you make people feel. That's how you'll be remembered.
I
Yeah,
think so. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Got a bit of a nerdy question for you. So this is
Great.
I, I love this part. It's the start of chapter 17. So it's when uh the body's missing from the morgue, there's a baby that's been abandoned, and someone's just been murdered. So all these things are
Hmm.
starting to happen. But so I'll just read this section. Please indulge me. In the backseat of Candy's car, I changed Scarlett's nappy, mixed some formula, then feed her as I watched the crowd grow. The mysteries beat through my brain like a chant. The car crash, the stolen corpse, an abandoned baby, a dead millionaire. What the hell is going on? The timing and proximity link the incidents, but I know from experience that while patterns and connections are important, forcing cases together can be a mistake. Each one deserves to be investigated on its own merits, and the victims need as much objectivity from us as we can summon. They don't tend to get it from anyone else. I love that because it was just this reminder to the reader. I was already jumping to all kinds of conclusions, but
Mm,
Gemma's going, no, 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 hang on. We've got to do our jobs. We've got to be diligent. We've got to go through this thoroughly. And
yeah.
then it turned out all the connections I was making were completely wrong. So I'm really glad.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess like I said before, it's funny when you're writing from the first person, it's both great, but it's also limiting because you are stuck with that person's perspective and you sort of have to go with whatever she's decided is the answer or whatever. So I really enjoy writing first person. And, you know, I think once you have a character established, if people keep reading the series, they obviously see value in her as well. But yeah, sometimes it's sort of I'm conscious of that's Gemma's point of view, but is that what everyone else is thinking? And so that's why sometimes I think dialogue's also really helpful in crime, because if we're only in Gemma's head and she was never talking and other people weren't talking to her, you might not kind of know if what she's sort of telling you or saying or thinking is actually sort of the broad consensus. So yeah, I always am quite conscious of making sure there's dialogue so that she's kind of voicing her opinions and people are responding to them, and you get a good sense of whether or not that's her perspective, everyone's thinking the same thing, whether or not maybe she's being a bit biased because of some kind of relationship or something that, you know, benefits her. So there's kind of clues in the way people interact with other characters that I think helps build out that overall story. So yeah, it's fun, but it's funny as well that point you make about the objectivity. Like I think in crime books, one of the big mysteries for a reader, I think, is you're always assuming that everything's linked because that's kind of why they're in the same book. And sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. And so I think I'm mindful. I mean, when I say I'm mindful, I probably don't really get particularly focused on this until I'm doing a second draft, but I am conscious by the time I'm editing a book that people are going to assume that everything is linked together. And is it or not is kind of one of the big things that you're trying to sort of set up as a premise and then solve. And if they are linked, then part of the mystery is how they're linked. So yeah, I
Yeah,
think it's, you know, yeah.
it was a fascinating journey to be on with Gemma because uh, it's not like there's cul-de-sacs or
Yeah.
herrings or anything like that, but it's doing the police work, doing the detective work to actually figure out what's the bigger picture here and
Yeah.
what's actually going on without linking things together too early. Um,
Yeah. Exactly.
the bit I particularly
Yeah.
enjoyed as well was, sorry, when Everett was trying to focus on the murder, and she was saying, hang on a sec, like we've got someone who's missing. She could, she could have been held hostage. Why aren't we also simultaneously looking at everything else? Whereas,
Yeah.
yeah, fellow detectives were sort of just jumping at shadows.
Yeah, and it's having spoken to quite a lot of people in law enforcement and lawyers and things like that as well, who I have huge respect for everyone in those roles and fields, because it's obviously really challenging and everyone's under kind of pressure and that kind of stuff. But it is scary how often things are um, separated, even though there's links. I mean, our court system is tricky too, because you can't take historical evidence into a crime that's being trialed. So other claims and accusations are not able to be shared with the jury, even though we know so often patterns of behaviour are so relevant to guilt and whether or not someone might have done something more than one time. So I feel quite conflicted about that. Like, I do think every crime needs to be sort of reviewed in isolation, but I also think that sometimes context is really relevant. And if you don't have that context as like a jury member, um, it does feel as if you've got information being kept from you that might change the way you would interpret something. So I'm not sure where I sit on that. I feel quite conflicted about it still. And yeah, cops, they get busy and sometimes things are missed and there might be sort of a slight link somewhere, but then someone's like, sorry, we can't pursue that. So just focus on this. And then you think, oh, what about all that missed linked opportunities and clues? And sometimes it's just a time thing, a resource thing. Everyone's busy on something else. Like it really has a lot of factors
Yeah.
involved in terms of whether or not a crime gets treated the same way. There's not actually a really specific roadmap. It's quite different every time. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. Like, I think everyone thinks it's a very precise sort of field, police work, and there's obviously so many things about it that are incredible, forensic and amazing and diligent. But there's also a lot of human decision making and error as a result of that, and choices. So it's just, yeah, it's quite fascinating, I think, from a procedural perspective.
Sarah, what's your interest? Is it more crime or justice? Where would you be on that?
Oh, that's a really good question. Like, I don't know. I sort of feel like I mean, look, I like story. I think I'm really drawn to stories, and probably what I mean when I say I'm drawn to stories is actually I'm drawn to people and why they, act the way they do, and why sort of different motivations come into play, and what people's circumstances might lead them to behave like, and all that type of stuff. So I guess the psychology of people and how that turns into stories is probably what I'm most fundamentally interested in. And then I think crime is a great genre for that, because it's all about that sort of almost exclusively. Um, I mean, other genres are obviously about human psychology as well, but I think crime really brings out like the extremes and the high stakes and all of that type of thing. So interesting to sort of think about how you would react in a certain situation, and putting different characters with different egos and different backgrounds and sort of go, how do you all sort of figure that out is kind of pretty fun. Um, but I do probably have a pretty big streak of justice, and when I hear stories where I think people have been wrongly accused or wrongly imprisoned, or the right people have never got closure on a certain crime or whatever. I mean, it's obviously just sort of heartbreaking, and you can really imagine how that would feel and how unfair that is. And so I don't really think my books are kind of on a quest to sort of make a particular point, but I guess they're just all probing different themes and sort of considering different things, and yeah, asking kind of questions and trying out different theories and things. So not kind of on any kind of political quest, but just exploring different thoughts and ideas, I think.
That's a good point. And does having that as your foundation allow, that's a very honest space. You're not trying to force the narrative into a particular thing. You just explore, it's exploration, so you can be very honest with what you're doing.
Yeah, I think I think one theme I feel like I'm quite interested in, because I kind of find myself coming back to it accidentally or sort of subconsciously, is the notion of sometimes the cops are put into a difficult position of having to sort of, or maybe lawyers too, of having to sort of do not necessarily the right thing, but it's kind of, if it's right enough, or, you know, for example, if someone that they know is bad, but they can't kind of pin something really awful on them, but they've done something smaller, that maybe doesn't deserve as much of a punishment, they kind of go really hard on that because they kind of feel like, well, at least that's some sort of justice. And it might technically not be legally appropriate course of action, but I mean, I can understand that, can totally understand that kind of frustration. So I think there's always these kind of weird shades of grey in law enforcement that are really sort of interesting to explore. You know, or like I have heard lots of stories about people being sort of jailed or punished for a crime that they didn't commit, but then everyone knows that they committed something else. So it's kind of like, well, is that kind of fine? And you're like, well, it's such a slippery slope though, because if you start going down that path, it kind of, where could it end? So yeah, I find all that like pretty interesting to sort of think about. And I think journalism as well. I think I've spent a few days with journalists here and there, following them around and then going to court cases. And I sort of think sometimes they're in a difficult position as well. You know, they're reporting things kind of as they see it, but sometimes they sort of know more than they're allowed to let on that they know. And then does that creep into their own bias? They're supposed to be very, very objective, and everyone's a human kind of ultimately in this process. So it's difficult to not have those emotions come into play, I think. So I think that's always pretty interesting to explore in crime as well, the sort of the ethics and the morals and the how do you do your job well when sometimes you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place in terms of what's right and what's wrong. So I think that's what I find very drawn to thematically.
Well, that's the morass Gemma Woodstock's in, and all of a
Yeah,
sudden murder.
that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Can you tell us a bit about that murder and what that then ignites in Body of Lies?
The murder that she
Of,
uncovers.
yeah, of Roger Kirk.
Oh yeah, cool. Yeah. Um, yeah, well she I mean she doesn't really know him, but she has met him recently and knows of him. And he's not necessarily a lovely guy. But you know, obviously he's been murdered, so that's very much requiring investigation and all of those types of things. And I think Gemma's very good at treating everybody sort of equally and wanting to do the right thing from a justice and her job perspective. But yeah, she sort of, I think, uh, uncovers more and more, and it's quite clear that you know there's lots of things going on with this victim. So it is, I think, interesting. Cops often have to deal with victims that are genuinely sort of through and through good people, and then the other extreme, you know, really really bad people. But you know, in our legal system, everyone deserves the same course of action from justice perspective and a legal procedural perspective. So yeah, I think they soldier on and investigate crimes no matter what, no matter who the victim was, what they've done, what they haven't done, no matter who did it to them. I think, you know, in I live in Victoria, and you know the gangland killings for a while there, quite a few years ago. It was sort of, there was a little bit of commentary in the media where it was kind of like crims just killing crims, so let them like kind of go at it, leave them to it. But I don't think that anyone in the general sort of job term was actually thinking like that. I think everyone was sort of still taking it just super seriously. But it's yeah, I think, you know, is all life equal? That's a big question. It's really I'm sure sometimes the cops get very frustrated when they feel like they're spending a lot of their time and resources on people that, you know, spent all of their living years trying to outsmart them. So it's tricky. Yeah.
What
I've
can you
seen
tell us
someone's
about?
asked a question here too
I
about
was going to get to that one, but do you
evidence.
want to do it? Yeah.
Yeah,
So
it's
it's
funny.
from
I say so. The
Amanda.
question about yes, thank you, Amanda, for saying that you love the book. That's lovely. Annoying, yeah, that's fine. I get lots of emails like this about different details in the books. I
Yeah.
think with that particular one, I think you're probably right, although I have been informed that regional and country town prisons are a lot less strict from a security perspective than anyone in the city, where they've got, you know, scanners and all kinds of crazy stuff. And they were being sort of supervised throughout the whole visit, so probably not so much of a problem. But I take your point. I think probably I wouldn't blame the editing team on that one. I'd blame myself, but fair point. I'll note it for next time.
Okay, Sarah. And if anybody else has a question for Sarah, jump in the chat, ask anything.
Yeah,
And
that's
I'm
totally
going to do
fine.
my absolute best for no spoilers, but what can you tell us
Mm.
about the frontier? Because there's some strange places in and around Smithson. There's some
Yeah.
stuff
Well,
that
like I
nice.
said, like I said, in the fourth book, which is, you know, 10 fictional years after the first one in the Dark Lake, Smithson is going through somewhat of a, I guess, a bit of a revival. There's a bit of a cash injection. There's lots of developers. There's lots of new business and new enterprise and people buying real estate, all kinds of stuff. So that's kind of happening. And at the same time, one of the residents of the town has kind of decided to. Sorry, you're asking about me about the frontier, not the cult,
Oh,
not the wellness center, the cult sort of
we
frontier.
can do
Yeah,
both as
cool.
well.
Sorry, I'm getting
Yeah,
confused about the
yeah.
two.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I had two themes in the book that I was exploring. One was all around health and well-being and the kind of the industry that has become. And is it good? Is it sinister? Where does it sort of sit in the ethical realm? So in this book, I kind of explore some themes around aged care and, I guess, psychology and wellness as both salve to people that need those services, but also just the reality of the business that it's becoming. So there's a whole sort of theme around that. And I guess because this is a crime book, there is sort of a sinister element to that, which is what David is alluding to. And then there's also on the flip side another kind of group of people that are sort of pursuing a much more sort of off the grid, not science, very sort of back to basics, primitive kind of existence, which on the surface seems very wholesome and sort of almost above reproach, but perhaps that's also not necessarily the most positive environment either. So I think it's sort of both of those pieces of the book are very much exploring kind of choices people are making, almost like bandwagons that people are jumping onto, and then whether or not they're good, whether or not people should be allowed to do whatever they want. But I think really, and I observe this quite a lot. I mean, I listen to a lot of podcasts about people trying to sort of cheat death, live forever, invest in all these crazy, you know, anti-aging schemes and things. It's really interesting, but they get kind of almost quite addicted to it. And I think the evil side of science is something that really fascinates me. I'm a big science person, but it does have the ability, I think, to flip over into slightly questionable motives. And, you know, anytime someone's being sold something and they're sort of desperate, I guess you've got people in quite a vulnerable position. So all of that is explored in this book in various ways.
It's like you were saying before about the police and detectives, and that they're human. They make mistakes. They're subject
Yeah,
to situations. Same in the medical field. Same in the science
that's
field.
right. When I first submitted this book to my publisher, and they didn't know like what it was going to be about, because I didn't know until I started writing it. When I had the first conversation with my publisher about it, and I sort of just said to her, you know, I think one of the themes in this book is that every industry is corruptible because people are involved, you know. And she said, oh yeah, that comes through very clear. And I was like, okay, well, that's good. Yeah, so I kind of like that, exploring that, because I think that yeah, you know, once you have three people, you can have a secret. And I think there's sort of a metaphor that can be attributed to sort of sideways to, you know, once you've got an industry where it's got money involved and people want something, you can manipulate that, and it's corruptible. So yeah, it's endless crime plots, which is great.
And that very human sort of warts and all approach. I mean, that's Gemma Woodstock to a T, right? You know,
Mm,
she's someone
yeah.
who's like Vegemite. You either love her or hate her, but she's very interesting, so you continue to read. What's the sort of reaction you get from readers or from people who engage with your reading, with your writing about Gemma? What do they think of her?
Yeah, it's interesting. I get a bit of everything, and I used to joke that, like, sometimes I noticed when my book first came out, people would sort of almost have the same comment for a 1-star rating and a 5. So people would say, Gemma is so frustrating and impulsive and crazy and wild and, you know, annoying, 1 star. And then literally the same comment, someone else would then be like 5 stars. And so I sort of thought, okay, maybe
Yeah.
she's just, yeah, like you say, kind of polarizing, and people will either like her or hate her, but at least she generates a response. And so, I mean, I'm very at peace with any of the feedback. I think it's all good. And I sort of think maybe I've got less negative feedback as the books have gone on, probably because if people keep reading the series, they kind of like her.
She's
Whereas
interesting.
maybe everyone that hated her stopped reading, so that's fine. But I've recently gone through the process of the Dark Lakes, hopefully, fingers crossed, being turned into a TV series. And that was such an interesting process because I was a little bit involved in the writer's room and having to really revisit that character and unpack it. And they break it right down and they really tease out every little sort of bit of this person and all the motivations. And I had to answer lots of questions and provide lots of thoughts, and it was great. But it made me like her more because I was like, she really has been through a lot. She's got all this trauma from her past. She lives in this town with her dad, who, you know, is lovely but a little bit hopeless. And yeah, it was a really good sort of journey to go on, and it made me sort of, I think I was like, yeah, no, she, you know, she does deserve a break. Like, she's pretty great.
Yeah, they're very relatable. I thought,
Yeah, I think
everything
so.
she was asking, I was like, thank you for asking that because I would ask the same.
You would say, yeah, cool.
Yeah.
That's good. That's
And
funny.
is there a particular reason that you wanted, you know, you said earlier you're happy to sort of finish with the character there, but you know,
Mm.
is that the arc that you are either envisioned at the beginning, or is this just a nice place to leave the character after 4 books?
Um, I think I think it's a nice place to leave it after 4 books. It does feel for me like she's sort of gone in a bit of a circle, and I think that feels sort of neat. I mean, I when I first wrote the first book, I didn't have any idea it would be a series. So every book's kind of come after the finishing of the one before without a long-term plan. So it's just been like a build of, oh, I kind of know what I think might happen next. And then there's a story that kind of matches it. And then it suddenly sort of feels like it might be enough to make a book work. So they've all been written just in isolation, you know, without that grand plan. But I did think the third book would be the last one. So I mean, look, I guess who knows? Maybe I'll come up with some idea that suddenly just feels very important to write. But for me, for now, I think she's where she should be. It sort of feels like she's made a couple of decisions about her future, so I'm happy to sort of leave her be and she can go off and do that. I kind of like the idea of maybe she pops up in another book that I write, just as a very, very, very minor character, so that I can kind of check in on her and go, yep, she's doing whatever she's doing. But yeah, I guess we'll have to see.
I
No
guess
big plan for another
yeah.
book. Yeah.
I guess the joy in the writing and the joy in the reading of following a character in a series and following the work of a writer, the artistic process of yourself, you know, that it's
Mm.
organic, it's building on one to the next. Can
Yeah.
AI, this is a super nerd question, but could AI ever replicate that haphazard, human, organic, artistic process that is interesting, like that you create as a writer? You know, that you have this It's not like you
Yeah.
sat down one day and just planned 4 books out in minute detail and then deployed them.
Yeah.
AI promises us the
Um,
ability to do that.
yeah, no, it's
Be
such
worth
a nerd
reading.
question, but I like it. I mean, I work in advertising. That's my full-time job, and I mean, we talk about AI now all the time, both because everyone's terrified of it, but also because we're starting to use it. So it's kind of one of those things that it feels like it's here no matter what happens. And with my author friends, everyone talks about it all the time as well, mainly because they hate it and they're scared of it and they're worried that it's going to take over. I feel probably um, a little bit kind of in the middle because I do think the genie's out of the bottle to some extent, and I kind of trust that we will not completely put ourselves out of jobs as a human race because we're actually not very good at being idle en
Yeah.
masse, and I don't think that would work. Um, art in particular, I don't think it matters what kind of art. The joy of art or the pain of art is the making, and so if someone can just write a book with a press of a button, there is just no satisfaction out of that whatsoever. And sure, maybe a couple of people, become wealthy somehow really quickly, although there's not heaps of money in books anyway. So I'm not convinced that even the AI robots will be that excited about it. So, there's that as well. But
Yeah.
um, I think could it do it? Possibly one day, because I guess it's getting smarter all the time.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure. I think it probably can become so intelligent one day that it can forecast plot points and pull them all together and bring out the right emotion and all those things. But I just don't know that we really actually want that when it all comes down to it. And I think there will be a bit of a rejection of AI in the coming years where people actively go, oh, that's AI. No, I'm not engaging in that. Not because it's not kind of fine on face value, but more because they want to read things written by a human and they're kind of opting out of that type of mode of work. Um, but the book that I'm writing at the moment is very much exploring some of these issues in a crime kind of way. Everyone else that I know is setting their books years ago to avoid technology, and I just thought, nah, I'm going to lean right in and I'm going
That's
to
right.
figure it out.
Yeah, for sure.
Because it's quite hard, but I just thought, oh, I'll make it work for me if I can.
Yeah.
It is quite hard because you do have to like do a bit of research and stuff, but I'm quite interested, and my standalone book, The Housemate, did explore this a little bit in how easy it is these days to commit crimes without actually having to physically do anything. And I find that kind of interesting because it's sort of it is a crime. I'm not trying to say it's not a crime or it's not as bad or whatever, but it's different. It's a different kind of sinister, I think. Like it's very it changes that whole thing around, someone grabbing you off the street if they're doing something creepy to you, but they're not physically having any contact with you. Like it's
Uh-huh.
kind of, I don't know, it is different.
Just sort of strips it away to the decisions. Yeah.
Yeah. And also the way you react becomes, and obviously your emotion and your, reaction to a crime or any kind of invasion of privacy or, being stalked or being made to be feel fearful is very valid. But it's different from if someone attacks you on the street, like you can only react one way, which is bad and scared. But if someone's sort of tormenting you, but from afar, you obviously have every right to feel horrified by that. But you could choose to not feel horrified by that too. And so I sort of, I think it's complicated, like responsibility of, yeah, victim, perpetrator. It's just, I don't know. I'm trying to explore some of that stuff.
Yeah. Can I ask you a
Haven't
question?
figured it out yet, quite obviously.
That's right.
I'm still trying to figure it out as I'm talking to you.
That's good to hear. I asked the same question to Chris Hammer, in
Oh
that
yeah.
crime is surging in popularity. It's always been popular, but it's really having a moment now, particularly Australian crime. But also, we discussed earlier that there are some social and ethical issues within your writing, which that you introduce. You don't set out to do it, but it's there. But
Mm.
it's that social commentary, it's that engagement with the zeitgeist. Chris Hammer said it's an exciting time for crime because we're the ones shaping shaping how people are interacting with writing as an art form there through
Mm.
which to explore those social issues. What's your observation of that? Is it an open slather for crime, or is it something that crime's always done?
I think it's sort of always done it to some extent. Like, I mean, I just think anyone who's writing is sort of, they're trying to explore something. And again, not necessarily a big meaty issue. You know, it might just be sort of how to tell a certain story. Um, Even really modern technological crime thrillers are still, when you strip it all back, it's still basic archetypes and heroes' journeys, and you know those narrative plot points that we just are touchstones to being human. But the tools and the tricks and the way that it plays out is sometimes now fueled by, you know, modern kind of channels and different ways to interact. So I don't know. I think it's same but different is probably the best answer I can come up with. You know, I think that crime is always a bit of a mirror back at what society's doing. I know what Chris means. Like, there's so many more. I mean, in some ways, I think the technology makes it more limited because you can't, like, you have to have, I mean, you know, to the person's question before, there's so many details and intricacies and things that you have to forensically kind of think about. And there's a whole lot of like dead ends really now when you're writing a crime book. You kind of go, well, I can't do that because there'd be CCTV there and then like it's just the crime's over. Um, but there's still crime in the world. So it's people always find a way. And I guess that's both kind of terrifying but also good for writing. But you know, like there's always human error, there's always fallibility, there's always dynamics between people. There's always good, there's always bad, there's always desperate, there's always righteous. Like those things I just don't think really change. And yeah, like I said, in my alternate job, we do a lot of studies on you know, Australia and population and demographics and things. And you know, things change a little bit here and there, but it's actually quite slow to change. And you know, the generations have always had their differences. There's always been sort of an eye rolling of the young generation. Like there's an amazing quote from Socrates very, very long time ago about the lazy teenagers in the town. So like it's, I don't think things change as much as we sort of think they do.
Uh, Coming tight for time, so this is one of my favorite questions to ask is, what was the
Mhm.
first book that ever really hooked you, and what's a book that you read recently or right now that hooks you now?
Can answer that really easily. So I read The Godfather when I was very, very young. I stole it off my parents' bookshelf, and I was allowed to read any book in the house, whereas I wasn't allowed to watch a lot of shows on TV.
I was the
And
same. Yeah.
so, yeah, and so I read some pretty wild stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And I read The Godfather when I was about 9 or 10, and I was like, this is incredible. I mean, obviously, some of it I think would have just kind of gone over my head a little bit, but I was absolutely hooked. I cried my eyes out um, in the key death that I won't spoil in case anyone hasn't read it. And you know, to be that involved in a grown-up male character at the age of like 10 is pretty strange. But I remember being like bereft for like 2 days after reading that, and I loved the whole mafia thing and just all of the different ins and outs and the, you know, the good, the bad. So I think that absolutely hooked me, and I just remember thinking, wow, I want to read more of that stuff. That's amazing. And then I have recently read The God of the Woods by an American author called Liz Moore. It's a big book in America right now. I don't think it's quite sort of hit here yet in a way that's making it particularly sort of stand out, but I think it was a big summer hit in the States. And it's about a girl that goes missing from a summer camp in America. First three chapters, I was a bit like, I'm not really sure I'm kind of into this. Like, I don't really get the summer camp thing in America. Anyway, absolutely hooked. An amazing story, dual timelines, incredible characters, just really, really, really good. So I would very much recommend that.
I'll check that out for sure. I
Hmm.
worked at a summer camp in America,
Ah,
so
oh,
I'm
you'll love it.
so thank you so much for staying up late to chat to us here in Western Australia for the Libby Book Club for WA. Thank you for sharing all of your insights from Body of Lies. It's a fantastic book, and really appreciate you coming on and being so generous with your answers. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in tonight. It was really great to have you.
Well, thank you for all tuning in, and thank you so much, David, for all your amazing questions. I really appreciate it as well.
It's a pleasure. I think we could have chatted for a bit longer, but time's against us.
No, another time. I'll come back.
Yeah. Well, good luck with everything, Sarah. Good luck with the writing for the next one. I look forward to seeing the Dark Lake on TV pretty soon if we can.
Look, fingers crossed. Yeah, I'll need a bit of luck to get this next book done, so appreciate it. Thank you.
Have a good night. Thank you.
Cheers, everybody. Bye.